Good afternoon. My name is General Gus Pagonis. I'm here on behalf of the TC Brown Bag Lecture Series, and I'm delighted to have the honor to speak to you about the First Gulf War. It's kind of interesting. Those of you listening who participated all have your own insights. I'll try to give you some of the ones that maybe you're not aware of. I don't know if you realize that I was not geared to go to the Gulf War. I was assigned to Fort McPherson as the new Axe Log G4, and I was excited about that. But when I arrived, a good friend of mine, General John Yosak, who was the 3rd Army commander, said, "Hey, we need your assistance because we're going to have to come up with a game plan to move a lot of troops over to Saudi Arabia and be prepared for action against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait." To put it mildly, I didn't have an idea what was going on, but I had done reforges, return of forces to Europe, and I was going to use that model, which trained logisticians for decades on putting equipment on ships, sending soldiers over by air, falling in on pre-position equipment, and using host nation support, trucks, forklifts, those kind of things to supplement, since many of the logistical arm had been placed in the National Guard and reserves. When I got in country, I had 3 people with me. Chief of Staff of the Army called me up and said, "Just tell me who you need," and that's when I went through a book and went through and said, "I need a port guy, I need a truck guy, I need this or a lady for this," and I was able to put together a team. Probably the only time in history a logistician got away with that, by Chief of Staff of the Army, who, by the way, was the head logistician under the Goldberg Act, which says the Commander-in-Chief, the SINC, is in charge, who reports directly to the chairman. And the service chiefs now become logisticians to supply troops, food, and stuff to the force. So I get there, and all of a sudden, 5,000 troops a day were starting to arrive to fill out the force, which would eventually be almost close to 500,000. There was no logistical structure in place. So we had to form it ourselves. We had to use host nation buses to transport troops. There was nowhere to put people up. We had to build camps. We had to use the Saudi Army camps. The 82nd Airborne flew in pretty rapidly with their forces first. And then the ships started arriving. Over 400 plus ships were there and offloaded. Transportation Corps did a remarkable job, and guys like Dave Whaley and different individuals, Dan Brown, who commanded the 7th Group following Dave, did a remarkable job offloading ships. We had to offload Liberty ships that were brought out of retirement, out of the reserve fleet, to be used because we didn't have the fast sea lift ships that you now have today. And we were fortunate, though, that Schwarzkopf made me the single point of contact for all the logistical field operations, period. And I was allowed to do whatever I needed to do. For example, we could slow ships down on the high seas so they didn't all show up at the port of Daman and sit around where you could have frogmen or enemy frogmen underneath, blowing them up and those kind of things. And Schwarzkopf said we're going to use the lessons of Vietnam to not repeat the stuff we did in Vietnam logistically. Those of you who served in Vietnam, the country was divided into regions. If you were in the northern region, and the southern region had certain type ammunition, there was a brigadier general in charge of each region. They would not provide the stuff to you because they became sub-optimizing for their area. Consequently, Schwarzkopf said, we're not going to have any of that. I was very fortunate. I worked, when I started, for General John Yosak, and then Schwarzkopf sort of took over and said, the logistician will report to me so that I know exactly what's going on. I saw General Schwarzkopf every week. He would fly and find me because I'd be out visiting various locations, and we would meet, and he would ask me about logistics. He would ask about the troops. Are they getting decent meals? Consequently, I was very, very fortunate that I had direct access to the Commander-in-Chief. Once the forces started coming in, I also had the luxury of stealing anybody off a plane that was a logistician and putting him in my provisional command. It was the first time in history we took National Guard, Reserve, and Active Duty and totally mixed the entire force. I had National Guard people working for Active Army working for Reservists. It didn't matter, or even AGR. Everybody was part of the logistical corps, which is basically what we now have in the military with the TC ordnance and and the quartermaster corps all being at a certain point, you become logisticians. I had quartermaster people in TC jobs. I had transportation people in ordnance jobs. It didn't matter. We didn't have time. We had no idea when the enemy would attack. He had 4 million soldiers. We knew he had the T-72 tank. We had no idea that the T-72 Russian tank was not one of the best tanks in the world. As it turned out, the M1 tank was far superior and was able to handle the desert environment, which everybody predicted they wouldn't be able to, and we had no problem in that area. I'm going to also mention some of the things that never happened. Had the war gone beyond 100 hours, we never dreamed it would be 100 hours. Schwarzkopf asked me, he said, we're going to get behind the enemy. Only a few people knew that. In fact, everybody thought we'd come from the sea or from the south, which we did have one corps come up from the south, but coming from the sea would have been ludicrous. That's a terrible operation. The guy on the ground, no matter who he is, has an advantage, and Schwarzkopf didn't want to do that. Going through the desert over about 1,200, 2,000 kilometers was never accomplished before. There's no roads out there. How do you get 150,000 wheel vehicles, ammunition, medical, and all those supplies into the logistical forward base concept? And the idea is we'd set up 2 bases, one called Log Base Charlie, the other one Log Base Echo, and then we had 4 or 5 other ones that we would implement and design and fill up as we were going forward into Iraq. We never got to those because we never got past Log Base Echo. Log Base Charlie and Echo were set up pretty much overnight by logisticians. I remember I asked Schwarzkopf, I said, doctrine says you should give me a division to help guard these things. He said, you guys have rifles, you guard them. He said, I don't have time to give you a combat force. Secondly, the end run was remarkable. We lost no trucks, no people. Everybody got the designated place, and we were there on time and on schedule. The 101st Airborne, it was a real sight when 425 helicopters all took off. The press had been saying helicopters won't be able to fly in the desert, the tanks won't be able to maneuver because of the sand. Soldiers maintained their equipment. It's also the first time in history in the Army that we had our troops together working as teams for 6 months. The enemy gave us 6 months to get ready. Tank crews trained and slept and lived together. There was no leave, no schools, no promotions. It was a tank crew that had to work together. It doesn't happen even in modern days. Tank crews, between all the stuff that goes on, you don't have that many days together as a tank crew. And then there's rotation. By the way, in the, I think it was the 72 war, Israel against 3 or 4 nations that surrounded them, Jordan and Iran and different countries, where a big report was done, and a general officer did a great report saying one of the advantages the Israelis had, their tank crews stayed together. That's what happened to us. In addition to that, once we get set up, my command ended up being about 70,000 military and 30,000 civilians. I'm going to mention some of the stories that very few people know about. The tanks that came in from the U.S. had 105 howitzers. Everybody wanted 120. In the middle of getting ready for the war, we had 60 people from Anniston Army Depot that volunteered, that came in and actually converted all the tanks that didn't have 120 millimeter guns to 120, and this was done almost in less than 30 days. In addition to that, there was no time for quality control checks. Putting the tank together, putting the turret on, taking it out to the desert and firing it. I'll never forget the time I went there to talk to the team, and I said, the quality control is you. Civilian corporations worry about quality control all the time, which I've been exposed to, and you have all kind of checks and balances. Not one tank didn't fire that was converted to the 120, and there was no firing test. It was all done by the workforce. And the Scuds were still coming in at that time, and they were great civilians that stayed there and worked. A couple other things. Had the war gone beyond the 100 hours, which we never dreamed it'd be 100 hours, we all predicted, at least on the ground, when I was there, 6 months to a year. Schwarzkopf wanted enough supplies for at least 6 months. Everybody kept bugging me, do we have 90 days, 120 days? I went back to manuals, which, by the way, were back in Korea when they were first developed. it would be impossible to have all that stuff that they thought you should have in combat. There was no place to put it. I had to get host nation trucks to haul stuff because we didn't have enough trucks. And consequently, we had to really, really depend on innovation and people, soldiers. And of course, that's the greatest asset we have are the troops, right? They know how to get the job done. Just tell them, get out of their way, give them guidance and support. But all that was done. But the one thing, had the war gone beyond 100 hours, where are the repair parts coming from? So one of my failures was, where are the repair parts? Both corps had different automation systems for ordering parts. The 5th Corps and the 1st Corps both had different systems. Where are we going to store the parts? How are we going to move them forward? And I remember Schwarzkopf and I were sitting one time, he said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, you know what? We're going to have cannibalization centers built. As our weapons have problems and get destroyed we will drag everything there, we will strip it, take all the parts off, and we will start our own depot in country. In the meantime, we're going to have to figure out how to anticipate the parts we're going to need and start ordering them, because they have to be flown in or brought by ship depending on the size. And we never had to do that. It never happened because the war ended in 100 hours. Had the war not ended in 100 hours, I think I'd had a nightmare on my hands. Although the troops did a great job maintaining their equipment, parts wear out, as you all know. And the port still could have stuff coming in, but we didn't have the fast deployment ships, so it took 25, 30 days for a vessel to get, after it was loaded, somewhere in the northeast coast ports. So that was one big problem. The other problem, which is kind of a difficult one and was never discussed, the enemy was going to have chemical weapons. He had anthrax. It wasn't major chemical weapons of major destruction like the Second Gulf War had problems with, saying they were there, not there. They actually had in their foxholes type of anthrax and different chemical that they could dispose of. If they actually activated it, and the only thing that saved us, they just didn't have a communication system for Saddam Hussein to direct it. Because in one war against Iraq, Iran and Iraq lost 10,000 soldiers to chemical weapons, anthrax and that kind of stuff. And Saddam Hussein killed many of his own men. So we had to worry about that. How do you handle a wounded soldier on the battlefield? How do you handle a soldier who's been shot and a cadaver, in other words, he's not living? What are you going to do with him? That's another problem I had that the Pentagon kept saying, how are we going to dispose of our soldiers? How are we going to maintain it? Well, we came up with an idea, and I ordered 500, almost 1,000 reefer vans. The press never figured that out because I told them we needed them for fruit and vegetables. However, we were planning any cadavers to be put in the reefer vans because bodies decompress very rapidly. If you've ever lived in the Far East, the Middle East, funerals are conducted immediately within 24 to 48 hours for religious reasons as well as for dehumanization and the fact that the bodies decompose. Fortunately, we never had to worry about that. And how are you going to handle it? Because it takes 2 soldiers to handle a soldier that's been demised. That tears up the force. So Schwarzkopf would say to me, okay, give me a game plan. The best one I could come up with was we would dig a massive grave, get the dog tags, and try to figure out how to gather the remains later. Fortunately, and I've always felt it was a blessing, never happened, period, for everybody's sake. Another problem we had, and it was very interesting, how in the world are you going to conduct various religious programs while you're in the Gulf War? I actually had Jewish rabbis that were allowed in country by the government of Saudi Arabia, and we administered to those soldiers of Jewish faith whatever holidays or whatever they had on the spot. That's something we didn't tell anybody because there was no need to. Soldiers were well taken care of as best we could. We had the Wolfmobile. For those of you who were there, I asked the Pentagon if I could get about 60 trailers that I could have take it all over the place during these 6 months. I didn't know it would be 6 months. 6 months we were waiting for the war to start. Let's take let's Mr. Wolf was a warrant officer, that's why they called them Wolfmobiles. The king of Saudi Arabia bought the trailers, bought all the food, and even allowed us to have hot dogs, which is, those of you who know, that's not something Muslims will eat. And we had hot dogs, hamburgers, and french fries in the Wolfmobile that would travel around to the base camps that were in training, and even took them as far forward as Iraq. Some of you have Wolfmobiles because they were supposed to be turned into the Saudi government. I only found about 4. The rest of them, the troops figured out how to camouflage them and load them on their trucks and bring them home. And I think there's one in the museum at Fort Lee. I can't remember. I think there's one there. Those were the kind of things that I didn't make any results. This was all done by troops. Troops, I remember Mr. Wolf said, we got to do something to get some food out there besides MREs. And remember, the Marines were there and they had a Class B ration. We got rid of the Class B ration. And the A rations were very, very hard to come by until we were there for several months. And of course, we never planned to be there for that long without handling a counterattack or moving out. Those are the kind of things that occurred, but I must tell you, the Guard, Reserve, and Active Force was total integration, and they worked together tremendously well. People don't realize the Guard and Reserve had different promotion criteria. So if I had 2 Spec 4s doing a great job, one's a reservist, one a National Guard, there were different ways for them to get promoted. The other thing that happened early on, and those of you who are Guard and Reserve may remember it, everybody thought they were coming for 90 days, which was a rule or a law that then you would be sent back to your home base. And I must tell you, I had to ask, President Bush asked if I needed anything, and I told him one day, if you don't get the law changed, I'm losing half my command at the time immediately. And it was changed. So everybody was there for the duration. General Schwarzkopf was specific. We would not have a Vietnam tour type setup where you go for 12 months. After 12 months, you would go home. He said, we're going to be there until the war is over. And those of you who were there probably remember that's how it was. It was very difficult on a lot of Guards and Reservists who had small entrepreneur businesses and were trying to leave one person back to run it thinking they'd be back in 90 days. And of course, they never did return. They waited until the thing was over. Soldiers did a remarkable job. My saddest story of the war, and I've had many people ask me what it was the last 2 Scuds fired. The war was just about wrapped up, were fired. One was taken out by the Patriots. The other one got through. You probably don't realize it. We had advanced knowledge of every Scud that was being fired because Special Forces were planted underneath the sand and had tubes and come up at night and be able to see a Scud fire and notify us so we could alert everybody, get on their mask and lay down and all that stuff. The last Scud that came through, if it had gone 100 feet to the right, it would have hit a Toys R Us. 100 feet to the left, it would have hit the desert, but it hit a warehouse. That warehouse had a unit that I had called up from Greensburg, Pennsylvania, that young men and women probably never thought they'd be deployed. They were a water purification unit, and I needed to dig wells. We were hauling water, which turned out to be not a problem because bottled water would fit in the pants of the soldier, and bottled water could stay cool in the desert at night, but I couldn't turn it off. So they showed up. My chief of staff called and said, we got this water purification unit. What should we do with them? I said, well, keep them out of harm's way. Keep them back at the port. This thing is going to wrap up, because I had just talked to Schwarzkopf and we were looking at how we would handle it. The last Scud hit that building. There were about 400 soldiers in there. 33 were killed. The others all survived because the non-commissioned officers were so disciplined. When the sirens went off, they ordered everybody to put their mask on and lay down, because when a Scud goes off, it goes up in a mushroom type V form. And what's really sad, I had all the National Guard and Reserves from all over the United States and the world. And so many of those soldiers were from my wife's hometown and my high school, which was very incredible to me circumstantially. These were young men and women. It was probably the saddest thing that I had happen to me during the whole war. I thought I was keeping them out of harm's way. Never dreamed a final Scud would come in and do that. So that's a sort of a personal thing that I haven't mentioned to a lot of people, but it was very close to home when I was going through the list. And in the hospital, people were from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, Monessen, Monongahela, all the towns where I grew up. Final two things I want to cover, and then I want to open it up for any questions that you may have. I'll be glad to try to answer everything. I had to run the prison camps. When the military police showed up, Schwarzkopf, they were reporting directly to General Schwarzkopf. Next thing I knew, a brigadier general from New York, National Guard unit says, "Hey, I've been assigned to you." I said, "All right, you can join the medical doctors who are protesting. What are they doing working for a logistician?" And he said, "No, I understand. At least we'll work something. But I want to tell you something. We're going to have prisoners, and we don't have any prison camps." I said, "Okay, I don't know. How many do you think?" He said, "Well, my guy said it'd be a couple thousand right away." 60,000 prisoners were taken within 24 to 48 hours. Many of them just surrendered. If they were not if they were not Republican Guard, they were reserve type people, hadn't ate, been paid. They just gave up. They just put in fact, some of them used to give up to a drone. They just wanted to go to the camp. We didn't have to worry about keeping them there. We did have barbed wire set up with engineer tape, and we cleaned them and had to delice them. Many of them wanted to stay. That was something that wasn't predicted. What really wasn't predicted, when a Harvard graduated brigadier general from Iraqi army came in to see me saying, "You need to read the Geneva Convention." "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, you're violating an international Geneva Convention law." I said, "What's that?" He said, "We don't have any cigarettes." I'm a non-smoker, so I wasn't very sympathetic. But then he said, so I checked the Geneva Convention. I had read it many, many, many years ago. So I read it, and sure enough, you're supposed to set up canteens. Prisoners are paid a small amount, and you'd have toothpaste, shaving cream, and other facts in this canteen, and they would pay for them. And I said to the brigadier general, I said, "Hey, you don't need anything. I'm giving you free toothpaste and all that kind of stuff." He said, "Well, we need cigarettes." Somehow that got to the Red Cross. The Red Cross did come and inspect the prison camps, and I was put over the red carpet saying, "You're going to have to provide some means of cigarettes." And being as stubborn as I am sometimes, I fought it. Fortunately, the King of Saudi Arabia provided all the cigarettes free. So I was able to issue the cigarettes. One thing at the prison camps, when a caravan would go by, they heard President Bush was in country, they would chant his name, which seemed kind of weird. But the Republican Guard Army was a different story. We didn't have very many prisoners from the Republican Guard Army. It was all the reserves. Those are some of the different stories that occurred. The final one I want to mention to you, it really gives to the innovation of young soldiers. At this time, my command had grown pretty big. The war was over, and the Secretary of Agriculture of the United States came and saw me and said, "You're going to have everything washed. Sand can harbor a disease that could spread to our wildlife flocks in the United States, devastate the poultry industry. Everything will have to be inspected." I had about 200,000 wheel vehicles because everybody left their equipment there. Except for the 24th Division, we parked all the tanks in the desert, and I had Bedouins guarding them to make sure nothing was taken. But the Soviet Union had been disbanded. It wasn't in existence. And we had it all parked out in the desert, 1,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers away from the port. We had to figure out how to clean this stuff, bring it in, and get it inspected. Now, nobody could come up with a great idea, except I was out in the field talking to the soldiers, and the guy said, "Hey, I got a simple solution. Let's get rubber matting. Let's dig a big hole, put rubber matting in it, build a rack for vehicles can drive out on the rack. We'll wash them down with hoses. The water will go into the rubber mat, and we'll put it through the reverse osmosis units," which I had all kind of them in country. We didn't need them. "And we'll reuse the water. We'll then drive the vehicle off the ramp onto a truck, take them to the port, set up fire trucks with hoses to drive through and hose them down again, and then the agriculture inspector would give the okay." That was great until we found out they gave me 2 agriculture inspectors. So I finally got through to somebody, and I ended up getting about 100. There was no way we could get everything inspected. We were given 2 years. The mission was to be there a year and a half, 2 years to finish it. It all got done in about 6, 7 months due to the ingenuity and the hard work. Plus, these were all individual ready reserve that never dreamed they'd be called up. 6,000 of them were called up. Everybody else went home, and I was asked to stay, and they did a great job. So that's some of them. I'm looking forward to any questions you have, and I'll be more than happy to try to answer them.
So my first question is, talk about women over during Desert Storm, because there was a cultural difference between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia.
Oh yeah, that was a nightmare at first. First of all, the women soldiers, 12% of my command were female soldiers, and they drove forklifts and everything else. The first problem I had, there were female guards guarding near mosque, which really upset the Arab population, male population, because women aren't supposed to carry weapons, let alone guard them. There was all kind of that kind of stuff. Forklift operators, they wanted them fully clothed, and our male soldiers could have a T-shirt. I had to get through all that. Finally made an appointment and got to see Prince Mohammed, who was the king's son and also the eastern governor, he was the governor of the eastern province, which had the whole east coast of Saudi Arabia. He personally was able to get the religious police to go to Jeddah and get out of the area, which allowed some flexibility. But we tried to follow the rules and honor cultures. There were no incidents between soldiers and civilians, and we had 500,000 troops there. Now, I realize someone's going to say, well, there was no drinking. Except I did have some stills. Some people from Alabama and Georgia figured out how to make stills, and my chaplain came to me, we got to do something or they're going to make people blind. But there just was no drinking. So you didn't have any of that alcohol problem. There were never any incidents. We respected the country and we respected their rights. I think women came into their own in the armed forces during the Gulf War. There was no discrimination between the sex. It didn't matter. You just did your job.
Okay, so can you just let people know that they can write they can write a comment in the, there was a question that came in by text. People can write a comment in the Facebook, and I can be able to read the questions to you. So here's the first question. How were the MCTs used? Was logistical tracking a difficulty, or was it ever so fast that it was not needed?
No, it was needed. It was needed. We had the largest intersection ever done in history. We had both corps in the wrong place. We had the Third Corps on the left. They were on the left, and we had the First Corps from Fort Bragg on the right. We need to switch them on the battlefield. We had to have an intersection set up on the battlefield to cross two corps. Never been done in history. What's interesting, I had an engineer, and I like engineers, but this guy came in, I think he was a two-star, said, hey, I'm going to tell Schwarzkopf, we're going to build a bridge, and one corps will go under and one corps will go over. And I said, we don't have the material to build a bridge, plus building something in the sand, I've learned, although it was pretty hard, is difficult to do, and we don't have a lot of time here, because decide to switch the two corps and get the fifth corps from Germany on the right-hand side, so it would attack south. We were going to do the end run with logistical bases, secret logistical bases set up, and logistics became ahead of the combat side, and we had to get them in the right place. And I'll never forget it, and we had all these elaborate things, and this guy actually briefed Schwarzkopf, and Schwarzkopf dismissed him and said, that's not going to work. So I remember the old Patton movie when he was standing out there directing traffic. So I got the MPs and I said, okay, get the movement control teams. Let's get out there. We'll give everybody so many minutes. They'll go through, they'll stop, and the next one will go through. It was accomplished almost flawlessly in less than a day. And it's incredible when you think about it. A couple 100,000 troops in each corps getting on the right side for the attack. So yes, they were effective. Where I had my problem was on the highways. Pipeline Road, I think it was called Tapline Road, went across, and there was one highway going north. At one time, when trucks were going north to set up anything, unpacking and getting people to different places for staging areas, I had to use a helicopter to get from one side of the highway to the other side because there was trucks bumper to bumper. Then you had all the Kuwaitis coming down, and there was no driving license required, and small children on pillows trying to drive cars, weaving in and out. I'm not very pleased. We had a lot of soldiers lost their lives in traffic accidents in that first part because it was a 2-lane highway. It was so congested. But the movement control teams, I think, did a terrific job, or we had a real disaster. So it wasn't fast moving in a sense, except for that intersection had to be done fast, but it was a continuous issue.
So any lessons learned from the retrograde operation?
Well, the first thing I learned, we had not enough forklifts in the Army. We didn't have enough vehicles. When I was a young major, we got rid of Jeeps for the first sergeant and the S4, which was stupid. One of the things I worked on that I had to suffer for later in life. We would actually go into an oil field where Saudis had equipment that was sitting there, hundreds and hundreds of forklifts, and the soldiers went in there and got them all started and running. That's what we had to use for the first month, 2 months of the war. Equipment was something that was difficult to keep up with, but we were able to. And we cannibalized other forklifts for the parts because we didn't have the repair parts.
Okay. Next question. There are a bunch of questions. So there's a bunch of questions. What was the impetus behind Half Moon Bay and the Love Boat?
Well, that was a conversation between Schwarzkopf and myself. Bahrain, you could have a drink in Bahrain. And there was a big bridge that goes across there from Saudi Arabia. Before I go there, that was my escape plan. When I was first there, I got a phone call from the Pentagon. Okay, you're there, the 82nd's there. What are you guys going to do if Saddam Hussein attacks? I said, I have no idea. I'm not a tactician. They said, well, we need an answer. What are you going to do with the logistics part? I said, I'm going to go across to Bahrain and I'll blow up the bridge. And that didn't go over real well. Fortunately, we never had to worry about it. But the Love Boat, I said, we ought to get a boat in here, a cruise ship, and park it, and soldiers could go there for a 2-3 day break, because remember, they were in the 120-degree sand training every day. And he said, okay. And contacted some people. Next thing I knew, the shipping line volunteered, and that's how the Love Boat came in. And we had shows, and you could have a beer and a drink, and it went over very, very, very well. The troops were well disciplined, and I don't know if too many incidents. There's a couple incidents broke out, but nothing dramatic. So that's how that happened, and Schwarzkopf was thrilled to do it. Again, there weren't a lot of people signed up in the Pentagon thinking it was a good idea, because they all thought, hey, the war's going to happen. But we didn't know how long we were going to be there, and I kept saying, well, if a war happens, we shut it down, we send it home.
Okay, so next question is, do you remember the daily lunchtime hard court basketball games played out in 120-degree heat?
Yeah, I've been accused of being a...
He says, I was a young captain who guarded Lieutenant General Pagonis and recall all the all-out aggressive play. He could give it as well as take it. Colonel Ireland and Mark Henderson were a couple of regulars.
Yeah, to break the monotony, we average about an 18-hour day. I required everybody to try to get 4 to 6 hours sleep a night. I used to get about 4 hours, but every day at noontime, we'd have pickup games of basketball. I liked the heat. I always worried we were going to fight the Soviet Union. We'd be in Siberia and I'd freeze to death. But we had some good games. Even Vice President Quell played against our team. And I remember I told the guys, okay, guys, we got to hold back because we didn't have any refs. And I said, I don't want anybody hitting the vice president. He gets the ball in the first play, bam, 2 guys laid him out. I'll never forget it. The Secret Service went nuts. And I even think it's on CNN. Somebody taped it. But, yeah, I do remember it. And, by the way, I continued that when I went to Sears. I set up basketball courts. Being 5'6", when I was 5'6", I was 5'6" in 8th grade, and I stopped growing. But other people, if we had a 6-foot person, he was a center back in the 50s. Today, you're 6'5" and you're a guard. But I enjoyed basketball. And when I was in the 21st Theater Army Commander, or even a battalion commander, I used to always go to the gym at noontime. And a lot of times I'd go at least a couple of weeks before anybody knew who I was. And it would be interesting to hear the troops talking and getting their views of what's going on.
Sean Weiss says he remembers the Secret Service telling you guys to back down. How were third country drivers handled?
Well, I got to tell you, they were magnificent. My own son, who was a captain, we had him set up by water delivery. Water was the most critical thing on the battlefield. Not ammunition, not medical supplies, water. And he set it up, and we had a few military he had, but the rest were Pakistani, Filipinos, and different type drivers. And the only problem we had, they used to love to cook lunch underneath an ammo truck. And I had to try to figure out how to stop that. They'd build their little fires underneath an ammo truck and get out of the heat. But the big way we handled it, and Schwarzkopf thought it was extremely amusing, they all loved wrestling. So we got a bunch of wrestling tapes, and every day when they would come back, I'd have TV set up where somebody set it up, not me, had TV set up where the troops where the third parties could watch actually wrestling matches, and that was the draw to bring them back. I can't tell you, for years afterwards, I got letters from them requesting to bring them to the United States. Of course, I had no authority to do that. All this stuff I'm mentioning, I didn't think of anything. This is all done by subordinates. It was pretty easy. Just, hey, can't afford not to have the drivers come back, because we had to train them. And nobody spoke English. And eventually, we were able to, with sign language and camaraderie, Americans did a great job. American soldiers did a great job integrating themselves with the third party. If we didn't have them, I don't know how in the world we could have moved all the equipment we had to move forward while we were preparing for the war.
And so next question is, how did you get so many hets?
There are not too many hets in the United States Army, but the Egyptian government sent me a het battalion, okay? And they sent me about 60 hets. All the other tanks we had to haul on regular trucks and break the axles or try to some guy came up with a great idea of reinforcing the axles. So I used the Egyptian hets to move tanks on the battlefield. You don't want tanks to drive on the battlefield if they don't have to. You want to move them, right? I got a bill. It's one of the things I had to discuss with the Senate Armed Services Committee. I got a bill from the Egyptian government for the use of their trucks the whole time, because they didn't do anything else except haul for us, the U.S. forces.
I remember the hets and the Egyptians there. That's cool. Okay, so Dan Brown wants you to mention how you communicated with your commanders. As an example, your five cards.
Well, Dan Brown, I haven't talked to you for a while. He did a terrific job. He took over the 7th Group Port, did a magnificent job. We didn't have, I tell young people this, and they look at me like I'm a caveman. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have any kind of form of communication. We used 3x5 cards. People would write a 3x5 card. We'd have Humvees, and not Humvees, yeah, I guess it was Humvees, and helicopters deliver them. And you had to say everything on the front, no more, a little bit of the back of a 3x5 card. And I could, if it came to me through the chain of command, because nobody could change it, nobody could wordsmith it, nobody had to rewrite it. It just came straight. Some of them I sent right to Schwarzkopf. And by the way, we couldn't scan or fax them. I had to send them by runner. In the civilian world, I'm trying to work on emails. Emails are way, way, way too long, and I'm sure they're that way now in the armed forces. And I'm trying to work with some of these smart IT people that you get electrocuted if you exceed so many lines. But I can't find anybody to do that. Then I'm trying to find somebody that you can't push the button to send it to 200 people for copies. But we communicated very, very effectively. I'd get maybe 100 3x5 cards a day that came through the chain of command, and I would just look at them because they would go to Dan Brown or Dave Whaley or any of the colonels, the generals are in the theater, and they would write a note, and then I would still see it. Negative information flowed all the time. Nobody was afraid to tell me I was screwed up or doing something wrong, and nobody was afraid to say, hey, we're not doing this right, let's do that. If negative information will flow, which it did, we were able to stay on top of stuff. And so it worked extremely well. And I've picked it up for the civilian world, but it's on the internet, and boy, some internet emails are so long, I just don't read them. I tell people if it's going to be longer than the front and back of a 3x5 card, I'm just not going to read it. The other way I communicated, and I would go out and visit before we had the end run and had the log bases set up. I had a couple hours that I could go out and talk to commanders. And I would go and make a presentation. One thing about Saudi Arabia, they had magnificent theaters and gyms around all the place. We'd put the troops in, and then I would bring the battalion commander would brief on what he was going to do. He only had 15 minutes, and he would brief on his game plan. Then his captains would stand up there in front of the audience after the battalion commander briefed, and we'd say, "Do you agree with this?" And each captain, each company commander had to answer, "Yeah, I agree, but I don't think this will work or that'll work." And it was an incredible thing. It's on tape. One of the first things I did was hire a couple of historians and formed a team. I taped every mistake I made, and I taped all these conversations. Most of them are at the Fort Lee Library. I've donated all my stuff there, and that's where it is. But those were the ways we communicated.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we will go with Alexandra Georgie asks, how did you decide to plant the 22nd at KKMC?
Okay, I was out in the desert one time looking things around, and I saw this Emerald City, and I call it the Emerald City because any of you have been there, in the middle of nowhere, just magnificent facility with 50-meter Olympic-sized swimming pool. And I said, okay, that's going to be the forward base for the logistics. Then I found a couple trailers that we were going to have to move forward. We didn't have the luxury of the combat arms people, or what I had as a DISCOM commander, take a truck and make up the inside so it would be a moving operations center. KKMC, believe it or not, is at the crossroads of ancient trails, camel trails and caravan trails. And I had a Saudi advisor tell me that's where you need to go. And that's when I first said, well, I don't know, it's in the middle of nowhere. He says, no, there's a city there. And that was it. We called it the Emerald City from Wizard of Oz because it was a magnificent facility. And then we had the French Foreign Legion was stationed there. And that was going to be our jump off point had the war lasted 6 months to a year.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. We will be showing the 22nd Support Command video at the museum on Saturday at 2 p.m. If you can come to the museum on Saturday, 2 p.m., we welcome you there. We're going to have popcorn and stuff to drink. And I want to thank you very much for doing this brown bag lunch lecture for the
Well, thanks for setting it up. I got to tell you a little bit about the 22nd Subcom video.
Okay.
One day, I had 3 guys come into my office. They had long hair, so at first I thought they were medical guys because the medical command came underneath me. And they said, no, you turn us loose and we can do a movie on logistics. Because most movies are made about the combat arms, right? Because that's who fights the war, and it should be. One guy was from NBC, another guy from CBS, and they were activated. They were Guard or reservists. They were activated. We turned them loose, and we used the Army Pictorial Command, which had a team, and they put together this video that talks about the combat arms, but it shows all the logistical effort that was done. How the log bases were set up, how things were brought in, how the Guard reserves integrated with the active. And so if you get a chance to watch that video, you'll find it very, very, very interesting. Thank you very much, and if anybody ever needs me, don't hesitate, send me an email. Thank you.
And visit the Transportation Museum if you get to Fort Eustis. Thank you.
You're welcome.